Hi everybody, thanks for tuning in for another development log video for my indie game, The Affine. It's a 2D procedurally generated tactics RPG, where you'll have the chance to traverse a range of procedurally generated environments and biomes, tame the wild creatures found within them, and use these creatures' powers to engage in strategic turn-based grid combat. In this latest devlog, I'm really keen to talk you through the improvements I've made to the progression for the creatures in your party, including their powers such as elements, techniques, and growth stages. Hopefully, I'm going to try and give you a better picture about how all these different abilities will be applied in combat and the incentives and motivations to explore, level up, and progress your party members. So, in Devlog 1, I documented the block of work where I worked on the system for procedurally generating animations for the different techniques and powers all of the creatures will have. And there's a lot of complexity there, but I managed to capture the information for the particle system in a class that I can now just populate with data. In Devlog 2, I talked about all of the procedural terrain generation I've been working on and the resources that could be gathered from those environments, which could then be used to capture creatures to add to your party. And in Devlog 3, I got a better idea of my combat mechanics for the game and better defined the attributes and fields within the data for every different technique, which will be able to be used by a creature. Now, I'm finally going to tie it all together into a game loop where I can explore a procedurally generated level, battle some wild enemies within that level, earn experience points, and use those experience points to invest in my party members and unlock better techniques, greater affinities with different elements, and potentially grow into the next growth stage, boosting my stats and power. I've been working on this project for some time now, and luckily already had a pretty good idea of the types of attributes that the creatures in the world will have before going into this block of work. Every creature is going to be associated with one or two classes, and I'm probably going to refer to this as something like DNA in the game. The possible classes are going to be fish, bird, bug, dragon, and mammal or beast. And each of those is going to bring its own set of attributes and strengths. This sprint was also a good opportunity for me to introduce the idea of abilities. Each creature is going to have an ability associated with its species, as well as a second ability drawn randomly from a set of possible abilities which are all associated with that creature. This is going to create variability between even two creatures of the same species. Furthermore, each creature is going to get the beneficial attributes of the particular class from which its DNA it's inherited, as well as a second ability, again, randomly drawn from a set of possible abilities associated with that particular class. However, if a creature has dual DNA ancestry, meaning that its DNA it's associated with two different classes, that means it doesn't get another randomly drawn ability. This makes it so that every creature, whether it has DNA from one or two classes, always gets technically 4 abilities all up. 2 class abilities and 2 creature abilities. Until now, I hadn't really implemented any randomly generated data for my creatures, so it was the right time to get started on that. As well as the abilities, I've implemented some other randomly generated fields, notably the color modifications, which are basically going to be randomly generated values which slightly multiply the color of the creature's sprite. So basically this will create a bit more variation between creatures of the same species, so that you could enter a biome and see many different colors of the same creature. But overall, some simple randomized variation between creatures of the same species is going to make the world a lot more interesting to explore, increase the incentive to capture many of the same creature and ultimately increase the replayability of the game. Each creature is also going to have several growth stages, and growing to the next growth stage is going to just provide a macroscopic boost across all of the creature's base stats so that they're generally more powerful in combat. They also might change size, meaning that they go from occupying a 1x1 tile area to a 2x2 tile area or even more. Each creature is also going to have its own skill tree, and they'll have to spend their experience points to invest in the skill tree and unlock new techniques to be used in combat. I've talked about techniques in some of my previous videos, but just so that everyone's up to speed, techniques are all going to provide some kind of melee or ranged damage, or otherwise are going to be able to provide a support or tactical benefit of some kind, like a boost or a buff, or even modifying the battlefield through elemental effects to construct walls, obstacles, traps, and more. Each technique is also going to be associated with a particular element, and this brings us to elements or affinities, which are going to be one of the central concepts of this game. Earlier in development, so many months ago now, I was trying to think of creative ways to introduce some kind of notion of elements into the game to increase the complexity of the balance between all the creatures in the game and make combat more interesting. I got thinking of a guy you might have heard of called Albert Einstein, who is responsible for the formula E=mc². Essentially what this means is that there is an equivalence between energy, represented by the pronumeral E, and mass or matter, represented by the pronumeral M. I started playing with this concept of energy and matter, and what I've come up with is basically a group of elements called fundamental elements, which are made up of energy, including kinetic, light and electrical energy, and matter, including air, water, and earth. These fundamental elements of energy and matter can be combined into more complex elements known as emergent elements. So an example would be the element of metal, which is made by combining earth, matter, and electrical energy. More isn't always better, and sometimes less is more, but I'm currently working with about 15 different elements, including the 6 fundamentals, which are pretty much locked in and confirmed to be in the game, as well as 9 other emergent elements, such as sound, fire, plant, metal, chemical, and more. Anyway, each creature is going to have an affinity with one or more elements, which basically means that it is going to be able to spend experience points to increase the power of any techniques it uses of that particular element. For example, a creature with the electrical energy, elemental affinity, is going to be able to level up its electrical energy affinity, boosting the power of its techniques that use electrical energy. This will make it so that simply boosting your stats of attack and defense are not going to be the only way to increase the power of a creature. And in fact, you might want to choose to specialize in a particular element. You might want to choose to focus on boosting your stats, or you might even want to choose to invest in techniques which have a greater base power and build a strategy around that. Ultimately, I think that between the elements, techniques, and growth stages, there's enough variety and complexity to offer many different possible strategies around the same creature. So basically, with all my data defined, I was able to get started on working on some improvements to the UI, which will better represent this information to the player and allow them to interact with the data as well, invest those experience points, and purchase new elements, new techniques, and new growth stages. The way I've chosen to represent this information to the player is by splitting each creature's information into static and dynamic information. The static panel is going to represent the information about the creature which the player can assume to remain constant throughout gameplay. And this includes things like the creature's DNA, i.e. the classes that the creature inherits attributes from, whether it be a beast, fish, bird, or otherwise. Secondly, the progression panel is going to be where the player has the choice to invest the creature's experience points, whether that be in unlocking new elemental affinities, unlocking new techniques in the skill tree, or unlocking the next growth stage of the creature, which is going to be the most expensive boost, which will provide an increase to all base stats across the creature's stats pool. After building all of the UI and hooking it up to the backend, the only thing left to do was finally start awarding experience points to creatures at the conclusion of the battle. Don't read into the amount of experience points or the prices for elemental affinities, techniques, or growth stages just yet. All I'm showing is the proof of concept that things are working. So, as you just saw, we started off with 5 experience points on this Komodo creature. You'll also notice that as we enter combat, the only technique we've got available is the tackle technique. Your traditional RPG first starting attack. Anyway, we're just going to pound away and finish this battle. Of course, as I'm trying to hustle here and get it over with as quickly as possible, I'm kind of allowing myself to cheat and use more than one attack in one turn, just to speed things up. So as we chip away at the enemies, we'll get on towards the end of the battle, and as you'll be able to see, we defeat the final enemy before finally ending the battle, opening up our UI, and as you can see, we've been awarded additional experience points, which we can now use to spend on some upgrades for our creature. So there you have it. The progression is officially in place. Of course, it is not finally complete yet, just like pretty much every other system in the game, but it's a really nice foundation, and I'm really happy with where things are at, because there are now so many elements of the game where all I have to do is just make content, as in get some art, put some values in the database, and all of a sudden these new creatures, techniques, elements, and abilities will just appear in the game, so that I can start testing them in combat and balancing things. Anyway, I really hope you enjoyed sitting through this devlog with me. There's big things happening here, so if you're a fan of the project, definitely hit that subscribe button so that you don't miss the next development log video, and come along for the journey. Otherwise, appreciate it guys, and see you in the next one. Cheers.